thanks to Stefan for this very interesting presentation. It is for me but the first time to see these possibilities for query in the relegation domain. Now I'm very glad to present Professor Dieter Stern and Lara Sels for the University of Ghent with their paper, which will present for us their work.
Okay, before we start, let me express my gratitude towards Amisaba Metelma, who kindly offered us the opportunity to take part in this conference, though there is certainly not much we are able to contribute at this stage, sorry. At the moment, my colleague and I only recently decided to take up work on the Dinsky sbornik, and we came up with a plan, the idea of doing a digital edition, in fact a re-edition of this particular manuscript. Our talk will basically take the form of a justification of our plans, which we thought a necessary first step before taking up actual work. Okay, so we will do this in a kind of role play.
Thank you. Well, preparing a digital edition of a text which has already been the object of a print edition obviously requires the editor to thoroughly justify his plans, and the more so if the text he sets about to digitize and edit has been dealt with in an apparently exhaustive manner already. And such is the case with the Codex Ganavensis Slavicus 408, of which we hope to provide a digital edition in the near future. The manuscript, better known as the Dinsky sbornik, contains the Sels collection of 16 pre-metaphrastic female saints vitae, complemented by a short topography of Jerusalem, and followed by a famous colophon, in which the book is said to be commissioned by John Sweatinger's wife Anna, and completed about 1360 in the northwestern border town of Brin, today Wiegen. Bought by the Ghent University Library at an auction in 1818, and listed in Baron de Saint-Genois' Ghent City and University Manuscript Catalogue in 1852, the Codex Ganavensis became broadly known to Slavists in the second half of the 19th century. It was not until the 1960s, however, that preparatory publications by Ghent Slavists, Frans Vinke and Edmund Voordeckers, heralded the editions about to appear in the 70s, in the early 70s. The Variorum reprints facsimile edition of 1972 with an introduction by Ivan Dujcev, and a transcript with critical annotations by Jan Scherpé and Frans Vinke of 1973. Reviews of both editions by Henry Birnbaum, Jean Darouzet, Dietrich Freidank, Helmut Kuipert and Jordan Zaimov followed in the next 3 years. Now recently, the groundbreaking work of our colleague Maya Petrova has testified to a renewed interest in the Ghent collection, and it has cleared the way for a new edition. However, as reproductions of the original manuscript have already been made available to a wider academic public, and as the text edition at first glance seems to supply what else would be needed for further research, our plans ask for a principal justification of all the components of the prospective edition in terms of the advantages it might have over the extant print editions. And this obviously requires a critical reappraisal of these earlier editions' merits and shortcomings. Inevitably, the editions of the 70s leave a few things to be desired on a practical editorial level. The much praised legibility of the high contrast black and white reproduction in the Variorum edition also implies a considerable loss of data. Not only is it impossible to gain information on the paper's structure, its state of preservation, the color of the ink, sometimes small parts of writing, such as supralinear signs, etc., are hard to read as well. Even if, at the time, the simultaneous publication of both a facsimile and a critical edition has been welcomed by all reviewers, the combined use of two separate books has been noticed to be unpractical, and these have been made to reproduce a facsimile folio alongside the transcript. Obviously, a parallel presentation of the Greek text, which have been used but not printed in the Ghent edition, would be called for as well. As already indicated by minor remarks in the reviews on the inconsistent transcription of Bayeki and ligatures, there is a clear margin for improvement of the transcript, just as there is considerable room for improvement on a text critical level, which is obvious already from some of the reviews, as well as from the publication in the 1990s of some additions and corrections to the apparatus by Jan Scherpe himself, so one of the Ghent editors, who confided us in a conversation we had a few months ago that he did not consider the edition to be fully accomplished at the time of its publication. However, as least as important as an argument for the re-edition as the shortcomings I've listed, is a considerable amount of additional knowledge that has accumulated over the 4 decades since the publication of these 2 editions, starting with the review articles by Helmut Kuipert and others, and leading up to Maya Petrova's work of recent years. The new insights mark the minimal surplus value a re-edition of any kind would achieve anyway. Now, whereas the previous editors, and many scholars after them, have assumed the Ghent Codex to be the original, commissioned by Arnold Wiedin, already in 1974, Vrijdag considered the possibility of Dinsky's sbornik being a mere copy of a lost original, which is meanwhile being proved beyond doubt by Maya Petrova on the basis of a new examination of the watermarks and the manuscript's paleographic and orthographic features. The Ghent editor's assumption of a simultaneous selection, translation, and compilation of the Dinsky's sbornik text with a pre-metaphrastic Greek menologium as a source has immediately been rejected by several reviewers who have rightly pointed to the existence of earlier Slavonic copies of several vitae in the collection. Especially Kuipert's review article of 1975 exposed the disregard of both the earlier and the later Slavonic parallel tradition as a major shortcoming. His listing of Slavonic parallel texts and their ascription to a very early stratum of Slavonic menologium translation has placed the question of the sources in an entirely new perspective, and makes us want to look at Dinsky's sbornik again as a text witness, among others, for each of its entries. Kuipert has advocated a collation of texts and parallel texts for each entry as a precondition for a proper comparison with the Greek models, as a more solid basis for conjectures and conclusions on a text critical level, and for a substantiated appraisal of the principles that have governed the selection and the adaptation of text for inclusion in Dinsky's sbornik. With her dissertation and a number of articles, Maya Petrova has done a tremendous amount of work in this respect by listing and comparing Slavonic parallels for Dinsky's sbornik entries, including, as was earlier suggested by Kuipert, the Macarian reading name as a basis for comparison. New light has been shed on the structure and the sources of the collection, even if many questions still remain to be solved. Since the 1970s, the whole picture of Dinsky's sbornik scholarship has changed. The image of some 14th century translator, compiler, working from a multi-volume conservative Greek menologium has shifted towards that of a 15th century scribe copying the 14th century work of a mere compiler of earlier Slavonic vitae, taken for the most part from selected Slavonic reading material. This obviously affects the way in which to approach a number of issues, as for instance the question of Dinsky's sbornik's language, as well as the way in which an editor would like to present this collection to a new digital age of readership.
Okay, so I'm now taking over. Just some water. From what has been said so far, a clear picture emerges that any kind of re-edition of the Dinsky sbornik would be fully justified in terms of the particular shortcomings of the existing editions, but even more so in view of the vast amount of new insights that have accumulated over the decades past. But justifying a re-edition does not stop at that. The further aspect more specifically concerns the technical components which shall form part of the overall design of the digital edition. In which ways may linguistic and cultural researchers hope to profit from having a digital edition instead of a conventional print edition of the Gdański sbornik? Unfortunately, the perspective I have to take here will of necessity be that of a naive user who has practically no knowledge of computer programming and related issues. So I will not present a definite work program, but rather preliminary musings intended for more qualified commentary from your side. For this short presentation, I have chosen to address the topic which personally interests me most, namely the topic of translation from Greek. Translation research as envisioned here is expected to place the Gdański sbornik more neatly into the wider context of the total corpus of early Slavic translations of hagiographic texts from Greek. In his introduction to the print edition of the Gdański sbornik, Vordeckers already noted that the translations within the Gdański sbornik derived from pre-metaphrastic Mediterranean texts. Although Vordeckers concluded otherwise, there is thus good reason to believe that the text of the Gdański sbornik dates far back as the oldest layers of hagiographic text translations into Slavic. As Kuipert, in his study of the legend of the 40 martyrs at Sebasti, demonstrated, even the oldest available texts, as found in the Suprasълski, may show signs of contamination from two separate translation traditions. More recently, Christian Voss has been able to prove the existence of two Old Slavonic translations of the life of John the Hesychast, and, well, the fascinating contribution by Evgenia Tomzova, which we had to listen to yesterday, makes basically the same point. So identifying the ultimate sources of the text of the Gdański sbornik or of any pre-metaphrastic compilation includes also the identification of the type or school of translation the individual texts may be associated with. Do the texts of the Gdański sbornik go back to just one translation, or can they be shown to represent different translation styles and thus to ultimately derive from a heterogeneous set of sources? Whereas Kuipert, in the case of the Suprasълski, has based his conclusions on the collation of the available variant readings, as does Voss basically, Lara takes systematic lexical variation in relation to invariant Greek source items as indicative of different translation styles and schools. Some of this systematic variation reflects the well-known, though possibly not yet completely understood, dialectal differences conventionally attributed to the two cultural centers of Breslau and Ochrid. But as Dagmar Christians recently uncovered in ongoing research on early Slavic translations of Byzantine liturgical hymns, there is also more fine-grained lexical variation beyond the scope of these well-established lexical variants, which seems to allow to pinpoint particular translators as schools of translators beyond the scope of Breslau against Ochrid. That there may indeed be significant lexical variation due to translation, or linked to translation within the Gdański sbornik is implied by Maja Petrova's observations on the life of Saint Eupraksha. And it may be pointed out here that the variants she lists seem also not wholly accountable in terms of Breslau-Ochrid opposition. How could an investigation into this kind of lexical variation in translation be supported by search and order tools which can be provided for by a digital edition? Most of the insights into translation styles and other forms of variation within a text or manuscript rely on years of intensive personal work on the text or manuscript in question, a kind of knowledge usually acquired by an editor and only exceptionally by other persons. Especially non-dialectal lexical variation of the type indicated already seems to be likely to be detected only by people with an intimate knowledge of the given text, and it is this type of variation which I believe to be central to identifying translations in terms of particular translation schools. Ideally, a digital edition would open up the possibility of doing variationist research on a particular text or manuscript to persons who do not have this kind of intimate textual knowledge. The traditional way to handle this would be to provide the text edition with a Slavic Greek glossary, and the better equipped editions would also have a Greek reverse Greek Slavic index glossary, which helps a lot in comparative translation studies, but still falls short of an optimal solution. First of all, fixed glossaries will confront the researcher with a sum total of all lexical entries, where you would rather prefer having a subset of entries relevant to your particular search or research. If I'm looking for lexical variation in order to identify a text as belonging to a specific translation style, the first step would be to exclude items with invariable translations, like, for example, a very simple example, theos, which is always translated as Borg, and items which, though they may show variation in translation equivalents, are, however, statistically insignificant. And finally, also items which, for whatever reason, show up in one text. I'm doing comparisons of different texts. This pre-selection could be done with the help of a sorting tool, which will not only be able to sort lexical entries in alphabetical order, but also in order of frequency of occurrence possible. The output of this sorting tool should also allow the researcher to further process the data in order to design an individual tailor-made database by deleting data which the researcher chooses to be irrelevant. For this sorting tool to yield the results you really want, that is to avoid listing variation due to homonymy of the translated items, it would have to operate on interlinear glosses with invariant lexical entries underlying the text edition rather than operate directly on the text. I'm thinking here of an apparatus similar to the shoebox program developed by the Summer Institute of Linguistics for the documentation of endangered languages. In our case, 2 lines of glosses ought to be provided, the first containing standardized Slavonic lexical entries and the second the according Greek translation equivalents. This would be the basic requirement for lexical searches in order to create a tailor-made database for comparative translation research. But this is not at all. Doing lexical research will always require corroboration by inspecting all individual occurrences that qualify as possible evidence. Here, once again, the database will provide a convenient device to alleviate the otherwise painstaking and time-consuming work of checking all individual occurrences that figure in the final list of chosen items. Every item in the list shall be provided with references for the place of occurrence. The references shall be linked to the body text of the edition. By clicking on the references, the pop-up window will open up showing the corresponding sentence or whatever, or context of the body text in which the individual item is situated. By clicking on that sentence, the Greek translation will show up in a further pop-up window. This is roughly my personal idea of what a digital edition should be able to do for me. The ultimate goal of the translation research envisioned here does, as one might guess, not stop at the Gdański sbornik. The scope goes definitely beyond individual manuscripts to aim at the total corpus of Slavic vitae translated from Greek. This implies that ideally other digital editions of Slavic hagiographic collections should provide devices for similar kinds of research in a standard format. Perhaps it would even be desirable to have editions which would allow for uploading texts from other digital manuscript editions in order to do comparative research within one database. The required aligning of digital editions to a common standard would lay the foundations for a long-term goal formulated by Helmut Kuiper, who was asking for a Bibliotheca Hagiographica Slavonica, which will finally unite all early Slavonic hagiographic texts. Thank you for your attention.